My talk is entitled Reading the Color, Manuscript Military Maps of the Fortifications at Louisbourg. I appreciate that I'm part of the Bentley lecture series. I looked up something about Anderton Bentley, who made this lecture series possible, and was delighted to find that he received a master's degree in civil engineering from the University of Michigan. Many of the maps I'm going to show you today are made by engineers who are often the unsung heroes of map making. So I hope that Mr. Bentley, were he still with us, would appreciate this aspect of the talk.
I don't know, just stop. Yes,
No.
I can't tell you.
I think we've got a mute. Good. I work at the Clements Library at the University of Michigan, which you see here. I should tell you that this library is on land that was ceded by the Anishinaabe Indians, that are the Odawa, the Ojibwe, and the Potawatomi, notably through that Treaty of Fort Meigs of 1817. The Clements Library houses historical resources to do with the history of North America from about the 17th century to the 19th century. Its map division holds about 30,000 maps, of which 500 are in atlases, or 500 atlases hold many of these maps. And we have a collection of about 2,500 manuscript maps. Our director, our assistant director, and our curator of maps, Brian Dunnigan, who retired in 2019, was a great enthusiast for military maps. And my presentation today owes a great deal to Brian Dunnigan's research and enthusiasm. Here you see him looking at one of our manuscript maps of the American Revolution. Brian retired in 2019, and he has continued to work with me on bringing to the fore the stories behind a number of our maps. The talk I'm going to give you tonight is going to weave together three threads. I'm going to talk about color on maps, which is a very important feature on maps. It's particularly important on manuscript military maps. And I'm going to use the fortifications Louisbourg as a specific example. We have about 50 maps of Louisbourg in our collection, of which about 20 are manuscript maps. They cover a very short period in the 18th century, from the Treaty of Utrecht at 1713 to just after the Treaty of Paris of 1763, when the British left the fortifications in 1768. So it's about 50 years in which Louisbourg was extremely important. And the maps of Louisbourg offer a very good example of how color works on military maps. Now, color in general on maps is
listen. I can't hear the TV, so I'll just put these in and listen to my podcast that I need to get on about.
Color on maps really enhances a printed map. I show you, this is a map from 1703 by a French geographer, and it was a very typical of printed maps of the 18th century. And you can see as a printed map without any color, it's attractive, but it's not necessarily easy to read. However, it was very difficult to print color in the 18th century because maps were made from copper plates, and to print in color was possible, but very expensive. Therefore, any color on a printed map had to be added by hand, and it really depended on the buyer's taste as to what kind of color was added. Here in this copy of the same map, you can see that color has been added just along boundaries. We call this outline color. And this was a very popular style of coloring in France and in England. In the Netherlands, a fuller color was appreciated by buyers. And in this case, the buyer would have paid to have a colorist color in areas to the taste of the buyer. So you paid to have your maps colored. You could actually color them yourself too. But maps were not made in color when they were printed. Manuscript maps, on the other hand, used color right from the beginning because those were the materials you had. Besides your pen and ink, you tended to have, if you were a surveyor who was making a map, you had colors that you added. It was particularly effective on topographical maps, maps that show the shape of the terrain, that show trees, that show fields, that show built environment, that show elevations. So a topographical map relied heavily on color if it was made in manuscript, as did a military map that was strategic in purpose. We see this map of Boston made by the engineer John Montresor right at the beginning of the American Revolution in 1775. A map done very hastily. You can tell it's not got a lot of details, but which uses color to identify built work. And we'll look in the maps of Louisbourg and see how these colors work more in more detail. So in thinking about military maps, we really think about them in terms of what they do and what their purpose is. Military topographical manuscript maps have three characteristics. They're always maps of particular places. They are maps that are going to show some kind of action, and they are maps that have an element of a time frame around them. Military maps tend to be made under strict time conditions, and they're always either anticipating future time or showing past action with relationship to the present. And so there are basically 5 kinds of military maps. There's reconnaissance maps that are looking ahead to a place and what that place looks like. Fortification plans, which show the built environment of a place and how it can be fortified. Strategic maps that plan for action in the future. And then 2 types of maps that look backwards, battle plans and theater of war maps that look back at action that has been completed for military personnel to learn something from that action. These military maps have one purpose in mind, and that's to win. So victory is always the purpose. And the audience for the military map is the command structure. Military maps are usually made because someone who's a higher rank than the actual surveyor or engineer has asked you to do it and has asked you to make a map with a specific goal. So that framework tells us, provides us with how we have to interpret the maps that I'll show you today. So let's look and see where Louisbourg is actually. And so I chose this Google Earth globe to position ourselves so that we can see roughly where we are in this southeast corner of Michigan and northern Ohio. Louisbourg is not on Cape Breton Island, which was known as Ile Royale to the French in the early 18th century. Here, just to the north of Nova Scotia, Acadia, and just to the southwest of Newfoundland. It's in great proximity, as you can see here, both to England and to France. And both fishermen from England and France knew very well these banks in the northeast part of North America, because this is where the cod fishing was the best. And cod fishing forms a very important part of our story at Louisbourg, because it's for the cod fishing that much of the competition between the English and the French occurred. This gives us an idea then of how close Europe is to the northeast part of America. And this was visible to people in the early 18th century because it could be shown on a map, like this map by Cyprian Southwick, who was a Boston map maker in the early part of the 18th century, which shows you the proximity of Louisbourg on Cape Breton Island to France, where many of the fishermen and ultimately the military personnel come from. It's basically, they're both on the same parallel, which made it a relatively easy traverse to get from one place to another across on the, and we have some charts that show precisely this traversal of the Northern Atlantic. If we look at this satellite map of this part of Cape Breton Island, we can see that the Bay of Louisbourg has a very distinctive shape. We're looking more or less northwest. And the site of the fortress of Louisbourg is at the southern end of this bay. And this was the area that was ceded to the French at the Treaty of Utrecht, which drew to a peace the War of the Spanish Succession in 1713. It was an area that had been a fishing port, a port de pêche. It was very important, as I already mentioned, the cod fishing. And it was also an area that was the homeland to the Wabanaki Indians, to the Micmacs in particular, who lived very much in this swampy and well-watered zone to the west of Louisbourg. And so this was an area where the English had been fishing and where the French had been fishing. In fact, the village Louisbourg at the beginning of the 18th century was known as the Port Anglois, the English port, or the Havre l'Anglois, the English harbor. The French, when they took it in 1713, renamed it the Port Saint Louis, and they immediately began to map this harbor. This map is not in the Clements collection. It's in the Bibliothèque Nationale of France, where many of the Louisbourg maps are, but it was made by the engineer Jacques Hermite in 1716 to show what the possibilities were for the French in this harbor. And you can see as we go a little closer in to the town, that the town was made up of a number of buildings and many docks or stages that stick out into the sea. It has a very distinctive shape as the area where the fortress is going to be built. You can see that it has elevation, it has higher ground just to the south of it. It has sandbanks and gravel along here that enclose a kind of wetland that get covered with the tide. It has another sandbar that extends out here to the right. And we have in this little example a beginning of our real appreciation of how color is used on a military map. We see that the gray tones are used in what we call hatchering to show elevation. It's not a measured elevation, but it gives you a sense of the rise of the land. Red is always used for built buildings, usually buildings that are masonry, but they can also be wood. A kind of watery green is used for the outline of water and then shaded out. And yellow is for sandy areas and for sandbanks. The numbers here in the harbor are soundings, usually in fathoms, to show a ship where the shallow waters are and where things get deeper. So this is the way the French engineers saw it looking down in plan. They also, engineers were very good at landscape drawing so that they could give you a view, and in this case, a view from the ship. So this is a view done in 1719 from looking south now at what, and you can see how low-lying the land is, and you can see all the fishing houses here. And it doesn't look at this point very promising, like it could turn into much of a town. But in fact, about 12 years later, in 1731, Louisbourg has become a city. This view of the city of Louisbourg has taken from that same point of view, and now we can really see the harbor and the energy of the harbor. We see how You can enter the harbor over here on the left. There's a lighthouse at the far side that just protects this entrance. There's that long sandbar and pond that we saw before. And now we've got two major buildings that really dominate the skyline. This is the Hôpital du Roi, the King's Hospital. It would be both a place for people who are ill and also a kind of guest house for people who came to Louisbourg. And this enormous building, which was 300 feet long, was the King's Barracks. This is where the garrison was housed. And you can begin to see fortification walls around the edge, over to the edge of town, and those fishing houses. Notice how busy the port itself is. There were as many as 100 ships over the course of a year that would visit Louisbourg, mostly for trade in cod fishing. And we can feel ourselves in this ship as we look along this harbor view once again to get a sense of the size. The population of Louisbourg at this time was about 1,000, and it relied again on the cod trade. And here we see in a little more detail these houses of fishermen, their racks behind for drying the cod, and the stages, their docks that they used for catching and unloading the cod. I'll show you a picture of that in just a minute. So with this sense of what Louisbourg looked like in the 1730s, I'll show you the first map that comes from our collection at the Clements Library, which is a plan done by one of the engineers at Louisbourg, probably a man called Etienne Verrier, who was the chief engineer of Louisbourg. And this is a map that really concentrates on the fortifications now, on how Louisbourg can protect itself. And you can see that the dominant color on this map is red, not only the red of the built environment of the town and of the houses of fishermen around the edge of the map, but also the red lines of the cannon fire, the trajectories of cannon fire, as a number of batteries were installed to protect the harbor of Louisbourg. The most dominant one was here at the top of the map, the Royal Battery, which had enough guns. It had about, I think it was about 40 cannons that could aim in two different directions. There was the battery over here at D, which covered most of the harbor. There was the Island Battery down here at the south at I, which also covered two directions of the harbor. So this was a very well fortified place. And there was one more detailed view of G of the Royal Battery. And you can see from this brown that it sits up on a little rise. The hatchers and rocks use a different color to show that kind of elevation. It also concentrates not only on the fishermen's houses, but actually names the families of different owners of these houses, the Saint-Martins, the Lacroix, the Delabons, the Dempseys. And there you see once again symbols of these stages. And to give you a sense of what these stages were like in operation, I show you an inset from a map by Nicolas de Fer of about 20 years before that has a little illustration of the pêche des morues, the cod fishing, so that you can see what an industry it was in a place like Louisbourg for catching the cod, for bringing it out, for skinning it, for drying it on these netting and tables behind their houses. And Verrier, as an engineer, also drew more detailed plans of what he expected the fortifications to look like. And here you have just the fortified city. This is oriented south is at the top. So our compass tells us that north is at the bottom. This, where it says the Partie du Port, was more or less that that viewpoint we saw when we were looking at the outline of the city. And this is probably one of the finest engineering plans we have in our collection for really using the colors that an engineer would use. He uses the green that we've talked about before, the red of the built area. He's also added here a kind of slate color. It's a bluish gray, which is for buildings that are built with slate or stone. He's used yellow for gardens. Yellow was also used for works that were projected, that were meant to be built but weren't built yet. But in this case, he's using the yellow for gardens. He's also using the yellow down here for the stages and the cod drying areas behind the fishermen. And if we go in a little deeper, we can see some of the details of this plan and the colors used and the concerns he has, where there's flooding over here on the right for that pond, which gets filled in at the high tide. And he uses numbering for the bastions that have been now erected. He uses a kind of brown for the glacis, which is the slope that goes down, and for the ditch that's around the built bastions. The Princess Bastion, number 2 is the Queen's Bastion, the Bastion de la Reine. Number 3 is the King's Bastion. There's where that King's Barracks was at number 5, the casernes. And we can see down here the entrance to the town, which is the little demi-bastion with its battery of 16 cannons, which would have been right along here. You can just see the embrasures where those cannons would have stuck out. Number 10 is a spur that sticks out into the bay, and it has room, as we see here, for 6 cannons. And number 9 is the gateway that goes into the town. And in the reconstruction of Louisbourg, you can see what this number 9 gateway looks like today. And there's that spur with its embrasures for cannons. Where did these colors come from? And who set down the color plan? Well, we can really thank a very important general in France at the end of the 17th century, Sébastien Le Prêtre de Vauban. Vauban and his counterpart in the Netherlands, Marius Coehoorn, were extremely important in establishing the kind of codification of how engineers should go about their business. And Vauban's ideas were put into a book that he wrote called Le Directeur Général des Fortifications, the Director General of Fortifications. And it's a how-to book. It's how you plan a fortification, how you go about building it. And it has in particular advice for engineers about how they should draw their plans and exactly how they should color them. That they should color with red, what we've just talked about, works that have been finished, that they should use India ink or gray for the ground. He goes on in another page about using yellow for projected areas. So books like this, and particularly Vauban's books, were available to engineers. But more often, engineers learned on the job. They learned from their senior officers. They learned from their fathers. Very often, young men became engineers in the military and followed in their father's footsteps. In that case, engineers could very often kept their own notes about how to color their plans. And the Clements has a very charming notebook, the Premier Cahier, the first notebook containing the mélange de toutes les couleurs propres au dessin de plan et paysage. And it's a notebook about the mixture of all the colors appropriate for designing a plan and a landscape. And in its many pages, it talks about exactly what colors you should use, and not only how you should use them, but how to mix them too. And the 8 basic colors it talks about are the color we've seen already, the vert d'eau, the color for water. The bleu de roi is a kind of slate color that is used, as I said, for stone and masonry. The acre chinois is what we would call India ink, which is the color you wrote with and did your outlines with. Indigo and beast are both darker colors that are used for rocks and for elevations and for that hatchering. The vert de vessie is a kind of bladder or sap green, bladder green, which is used for making trees and for coloring different parts of the land. And probably the 2 most important colors are gum-goutte, or yellow, and carmin, red, because these are the 2 that come up the most in coloring maps. One problem that engineers had in North America, because it was a very long way from France, it was about 2,700 miles, is actually having all of these colors available. And sometimes we see maps that really only use 1 or 2 colors. And I think that's more because of lack of availability than it is from neglect. By the end of the 18th century, these colors have become so codified, not only for military engineers, but also for garden designers, for landscape artists, that broadsheets like this one that we have in the library called the Étude pour la vie, a little study for watercoloring that's useful for not only for military engineers, but anyone making a topographical map. This is what I'd call a kind of cheat sheet. It's a sort of monarch outline series of everything you need to know about color in one legal size sheet. And you can see that the author gives you a design of a fortified town and the landscape around it, and is showing you exactly how that should be colored. He goes to the trouble of showing you precisely what kind of symbols to use, both in nature and in man-made things. And underneath, he gives you all the instructions about how to apply the color, how to shade it in, and what colors to use where, on what kinds of features. So color, by the period we're looking at in Louisbourg, is very well established. And the great advantage of color is it made maps very fast to read. And if you remember, I talked at the beginning about thinking about military maps, speed was often of the essence. And map makers didn't always have the time to write a legend or write something that explained what every color meant. They just assumed that their superior officers could read the map quickly because the colors had specific meanings for them. So we've left Louisbourg with, as a ville fortifiée, a fortified city with a population of about 1,700, but it's 1745 and tensions are increasing. We'll look at this printed map of the area of New England and Nova Scotia, just to say that by 1745, the competition for cod fishing on these banks off the coast of Nova Scotia was getting fiercer and fiercer between the French and the British. There was also competition to do with land. British colonists from New Hampshire and Massachusetts were pushing eastwards into what we now know as Maine and into this area known as Nova Scotia. But the French knew this same area that's in yellow as Acadia. And the British were helped by the Iroquois Indians, who were not particularly friendly with the Abenaki Indians of this area, who tended to side with the French. So there have been, by this period, by 1745, there have been skirmishes, there have been battles. And in 1745, a group of New England colonists decide that they will make an attack on Louisbourg, which is right here. And they're aided by the British Army and Navy, not in a big way. But that attack comes, and it's something that the garrison at Louisbourg is not entirely ready for. The next map that we have from the Clements is this map that's in English. It's not a French map. It shows the same kind of areas that our French map does. It's a reconnaissance map, so it's been made quickly. It has no topography around it, and you'll notice that it has no color except for the gray and white, the white of the paper and the gray of the India ink, and some brown of the compass rose. It concentrates on soundings in the harbor, and what it really tends to concentrate on are the batteries. We remember the Royal Battery here, the Island Battery, the battery that's down here around the King's Bastion. And if we look closely at the legend, we can see that that's exactly what the legend is telling us, that it tells us the latitude of Louisbourg. It points out the town, which is underneath the legend. It tells us how many guns there are on the 3 main batteries. And it's a map that's really concentrating on how you can get into this harbor and what you can expect if you do get into this harbor. And it finishes the legend by saying there's around the town about 148 guns. So if we go back for a minute, though, we will notice that the one place that Louisbourg is very vulnerable and why it has this fortification wall here is because of this bay over here to the west, Gabarus Bay. And that's the bay from which the British colonists are going to land and make their attack. They aren't going to attempt the harbor at all because of reconnaissance like this that shows that the harbor would be very difficult to enter. The colonists are very successful, and Louisbourg falls to the British in 1745. And this is a plan that's made after the fall, the French have capitulated. And it's made by 2 interesting engineers who are going to return as characters in Louisbourg 12 years later. And that's Philip Durell and John Henry Bastide. We see that theirs is a harbor chart also. It uses a little more color. It uses the yellow for the sandbanks and for the shallow waters around the bay. It uses red to show you parts of the town. We'll look at some details of this in a minute. And it certainly fills the harbor with soundings so that you know where you can safely take a ship. And we'll look at these lines more carefully in just a minute to see how they line up with the soundings. But we'll talk for a second about how this map was made. It's both of the harbor and of the fortifications. The harbor survey was made by Captain Philip Durell. Captain Philip Durell had only just become a captain at this time. He was a man who entered the Navy as a very young ensign at age 14, and he had just achieved captaincy of a ship in 1742. So he participated in the attack on Louisbourg. He's going to come back to Louisbourg as an admiral in 1758 in the second siege of Louisbourg. And so he, like most captains, he knew something about surveying and soundings in a harbor. The land part, the town and fortifications, were surveyed by John Henry Bastide. He was the engineer for Nova Scotia. He had actually given advice to the colonists from Boston about the siege. And he too is going to come back to Louisbourg 12 years later for the second siege of Louisbourg. He had just been made chief of Nova Scotia and chief engineer of Louisbourg along with that. So I said we'd have a look at these lines which are in the harbor. these are lines so that when you're in the harbor, you know, and you're on a ship, you know exactly where you are, and you can take your bearing by using the spires. If you see here, it says the spire of the barracks on the fourth embrasure of this line. So you're actually looking to the barracks up here at D, and you're lining up along an embrasure that you can see through your telescope, or you're lining yourself up along the flagstaff halfway between the spire of the barracks, or the flagstaff with the southernmost part of the barracks. And you can see he's drawn the flagstaff here. Or the spire of the barracks on the intendant's house is a mark for going through the inner channel. So these different, when we looked at that view of Louisbourg, we weren't particularly thinking about how we would use those flagstaffs and those spires to line our ship up and know where we were exactly in the harbor. Again, we can see the use of color for the earthworks around the fortifications and the red that we've become accustomed to for the built areas. Bastide made another plan of Louisbourg that shows exactly what kind of destruction was done to the town of Louisbourg during that siege of 1745. And here he uses red very carefully, as he says in his title. This plan of Louisbourg is intended only to show by the strong red the public buildings lately erected, and by the faint red such as have had a thorough repair. So a lot of damage had been done to Louisbourg, and so we can see that the use of two different kinds of red have emphasized both kinds of rebuilding of the place. And in here we also can look from his legend, where he tells us something specifically about each of the buildings. He's not explaining the color, but explaining the work that has been done or needs to be done. And once again, this follows that military map idea of time. What do I need to do? What is the situation now? What needs to happen in the future? And here we look closely and we can see how carefully done on an engineer's plan are these embrasures for cannons. And we can see how they match kinds of cannon embrasures in the reconstruction of the fort now. We'll give even though the British took Louisbourg, they didn't get to keep it. And in 1748, at 1745, when the British took Louisbourg, the French population was completely removed from the town and sent back to France, to La Rochelle. The fishing stages were destroyed, buildings were damaged. But the peace that ended this war in 1748 returned Louisbourg to the French. The population came back, and the French faced the problem of having to rebuild what had been destroyed in the British siege. It didn't last long because the French and Indian War led to another siege of Louisbourg in 1758. And in this map, a French map made after that siege, we can see that at this time the French were grossly outnumbered by the British by about 5-1. And the whole of that siege of 1758 is recorded on this very long, you'll see that it's 38 inches wide, so it's about 3 feet wide, map that records what happened in the siege of 1758. So this is an example of another kind of military map, the battle plan of the what happened when, what can we learn from this? And in this plan, the colors are staying the same, and we have two very long legends that do a couple of things. There's a legend for the plan, and then there's a legend for the action. The legend for the plan points out places that are familiar to us now: the Prince's Bastion, the Queen's Bastion, the King's Bastion, the Dauphin's bastion, the spur, and it goes on. But the legend on the right is something that we haven't encountered before. This is a legend that really describes what happened during that siege. The siege lasted for 7 weeks, from June, as we'll see, from the end of June into July. And if we look at a translation of what's being marked on the plan by the siege, we can see that it's almost a day-by-day account of the retrenched batteries that are brought in by the English during that siege in 1758, going from the 29th of June to the 30th of June, July. And we can see to the 1st and 2nd of July, 2nd and 3rd of July, 4th, 5th of July. And we see how they come on to the plan. First of all, the outline of the fortress itself with the Prince's Bastion, the Queen's Bastion, the King's Bastion, the Dauphin's Bastion, and the little spur that we've become familiar with. And then how the British, coming again from Gabarus Bay, from the same direction as before, hauling their artillery and begin to assemble their batteries, first at A, then at B, up here to the north, then down here at C, then they move up to D, then a tunnel is made here at E, and a battery of 4 pieces of cannon that can be directed right at the town at F. And the legend goes on, as you saw. I won't go through the whole legend, but you begin to see that on this kind of map, and here yellow is being used to highlight where these enemy batteries are and how they're moving. The legend tells you what the movement is. On other kinds of battle maps, you might have arrows that show you the direction of movement. A similar map, and one that's much smaller, it's only 16 by 28, was made of this same attack, of this same battle plan, smaller in scale, but it uses the same lettering system as we've seen before. It has a little slightly different detail. As you can see right away, you're struck, I'm sure, by this enormous ship, French ship that's in the middle of the harbor. The French ships were vastly outnumbered, as I mentioned, by the British naval force, but the British naval force couldn't enter the harbor, and for a couple of reasons. One of them was because 6 of the French vessels had been sunk and blocked the passage into the harbor. And the Battery Royale, the Royal Battery, was demolished by the French in order to protect the harbor from the English taking hold of that battery and aiming the fire at the remaining French ships in the harbor. An interesting feature of this particular map we discovered when we began looking very closely at it was the number. We had it on a light table for a different purpose, actually, to see the watermark of the paper itself, but that action showed us that this map is filled with these small pinholes. Pinholes, and you can see them even more clearly in this close-up. Pinholes were made on manuscript maps in order to copy them. You pricked pins into the outlines of the areas that you wanted to copy, and you sprinkled a powder, a pounce, that went through the pinholes and left little dots on the paper underneath, and you connected the dots, and that was a very accurate way of copying maps. People sometimes think that manuscript maps are just one-offs, that there's only one, that they're unique copies, but that's really not the case. Manuscript maps were copied over and over again for distribution to the officers and to other engineers. It was cheaper really to copy manuscript maps than it was to try to set up any kind of engraved copper plate printing. which was immensely costly and inefficient. And it would only be worth your while to print a map if you wanted to print, say, 100 copies. But if you're looking at 30 or 40 copies, much cheaper to have. Junior officers, ensigns learn how to, and it's one way of learning how to make manuscript maps was by copying them. That same siege of 1758 was also recorded in a battle plan by the English, who of course were victorious in this siege. This battle plan is even bigger than the one I showed you before, at 47 inches wide. It's about 4 feet wide. It's by a young engineer named William Bonteen. It's showing us pretty much the same action. We've become quite familiar now with this shape of the harbor of Louisbourg, but we also remark on this map that the topography is much, especially the elevations, such as they are around the town, are much more detailed in their drawing. And William Bonteen is very careful in his title to let us know, I'll go back, to let us know, we'll look at this title in just a minute, to let us know what the pecking order was of the authorities that were involved in making this map. He shows us the town of Louisbourg itself, which now really was very badly damaged in this British siege. You can see that the barracks that we've become familiar with are all burnt, and color is used in an interesting way on this plan to show you on the west side of the plan where the British have landed at Gabrus Bay. Color is used to show each of the regiments that participated in the siege, and the red and blue of the artillery make these colors stand out, making them easier to read. The engineer Bonteen, who made this plan, is very careful to describe exactly what the plan is meant to show. And he also tells us who ordered him to do it, that it's surveyed by William Bonteen, pursuant to the orders of Major General Amherst, who was in charge of the whole operation, the commander-in-chief. And Bonteen was working under the direction of Colonel Bastide. We remember him from the siege of 1748, the chief engineer. But even though the survey was done by Bonteen, we notice down here on the scale, this little inscription, that it was copied by Richard Coombs. And I add that just to show you that even though Bonteen is credited as the engineer for the survey, this particular map that we're looking at was copied by a junior officer, by Richard Coombs. After the Treaty of Paris, which ended the French and Indian War in 1763, Louisbourg stays, of course, in British hands. This is the Treaty of Paris of 1763 is when France really loses its possessions in North America, in continental North America, except for its retention of the 2 islands off Newfoundland of Saint-Pierre and Miquelon. So the British now hold Louisbourg, and the question is what to do with it, because the British have already moved most of their operations to Halifax in Nova Scotia. It's still important as a fishing port, but militarily it's not quite as strategic as it had been in previous wars. So George Spruhl is a very young officer at the time of making this map. He's only 23 years old, and he's on the staff of a man called Samuel Holland, who was the Surveyor General under the British for the whole of the Northern District. And Holland was asked by Thomas Gage, General Thomas Gage, who was in charge of all the British forces in North America at the end of the French and Indian War, to recommend plans of what to do with Louisbourg. So Holland asked Spruhl to make a plan of the harbor at Louisbourg and also make a plan of the town itself. So this is a George Spruhl's harbor chart. I'll go back one. He's used the colors of the greens and the browns and the grays for the topography very well, and we can see the red of the town itself. We also aren't feeling the pressure of time in the same way in this plan and in the next plan that I'll show you. And the reason I say that is usually these military maps don't bother very much with things like latitude and longitude. But Samuel Holland, who was a very considerable engineer himself, was very interested in the research that was going into scientific questions like the shape of the earth and definitely the establishment of longitude and how you measure longitude. Longitude can't be measured quickly. It takes a lot of observations of a lot of celestial objects. And so the fact that this map has both the latitude of Louisbourg at 45 degrees, 53 minutes and 30 seconds, and longitude west from London at 59 degrees west, 50 minutes. On the exact day that it was measured, on the 26th of June, 1767, tells us that there was an even not a military purpose in this map, that it had a scientific purpose too. And part of Samuel Holland's remit was to survey the whole coast of British North America from the St. Lawrence on down. The Northern District ended at about Chesapeake Bay. And then his colleague, de Brom, picked up the Southern District for a survey. So Samuel Holland, we know, had even set up a small observatory near the King's Barracks, which we'll see on the next map that Spruhl did for him. Spruhl was ordered to make a plan of Louisbourg for General Gage. And here again, we'll look at how he uses color. He talks about color down in his explanation down here. He has a very small note. I didn't make a detail of this right at the bottom where he says, the color red is used for buildings made of stone and the color yellow for buildings made of wood. And you'll notice that almost all these buildings have some little mark that suggests what their state of repair is. You'll notice too that there's no more fortification wall. It's gone. It's been blown up. After the siege of 1758, the whole of the fortification wall was exploded under the orders of William Pitt, Prime Minister of England. Almost, I think, as a symbolic gesture of the destruction of this important and very imposing fortified city. Spruhl's plan really analyzes the ruin of the town, this ruined front almost washed away by the sea, which if not prevented, will in time overflow the street. So even the destruction of the quayside is causing Louisbourg to be very vulnerable. In that area where the King's Barracks used to be, this little R right here shows us where he mentions in his legend where Samuel Holland had set up his observatory in order to make those observations that established the longitude of Louisbourg. The final interesting part of this map, which isn't really to do with color, but is to do with another way of how you project ideas about what you think could happen, is the use of a flap. The flap, this is a little piece of paper that's been glued on. This shows the state of the King's Bastion as it is with the destruction of the walls. But when the flap is down, it shows a plan that Spruhl and Holland are suggesting to Thomas Gage could be rebuilt. This King's Bastion could be built again, and those barracks could be restored, and this could become And in the letter that Holland writes to Gage, in which he encloses this map, he says this could make some use again of Louisbourg. But it was not to be. The destruction of Louisbourg was too complete. The expense of redoing Louisbourg was more than the British were willing to take on for a place that was too far away from the centers of communication. And so in spite of the plans that Spruhl and Holland offered, the destruction of the walls remained and nothing was rebuilt. And I found this photograph from 1907 showing something of those remains of the walls, the fortification walls, and the reversion of the town to that fishing port, the Port de Pêche, that it had been before the French had even established the town. This model of this image of the reconstruction of Louisbourg, which has happened since the 1960s under Parks Canada, shows you something of its restored glory that you can visit today. And I hope that this short presentation have given you some idea of the richness of 18th century military maps and the kind of story that they can tell. So thank you very much for your time with me this evening.